I had $2 and a tin cup the morning. My brother's wife told me there was no longer a place for me under that roof. And I want you to understand that, she said it kindly, the way a person closes a gate they have decided not to open again. It was the 3rd of October, 1871, in the high country above Pinnedale, where the green ran cold off the Wind River Range, and the aspens had already gone the color of old coins. I was 19. My father had been dead 2 years by then, my mother longer, and the small parcel that should have come to me had gone instead to my brother Carl, because that was the arrangement men made among themselves, and women were not asked. I stood in the yard with the cup and the $2 and a bundle of my father's tools wrapped in oilcloth, and I did not yet understand that the thing they had handed me with such pity was the only inheritance in that county worth a single thing. They thought they had given me nothing. They had given me everything my father knew, and my father had known the inside of mountains the way other men knew the inside of a Bible. His name was Eldon, and before he came west, he had cut stone and chased copper seams in the hills of Cornwall, and what he carried across an ocean was not money, but a pair of hands that could read rock the way a doctor reads a pulse. He had hands like a thing carved from the same gray stone he worked, the knuckles swelled and the nails gone flat and split, and when he laid one of those hands against a rock face and went still, I learned as a small girl to go still too, because he was listening, and what he heard he could never quite put into words for me, only into the slow, careful work that followed. He used to say, "A mountain is never as cold as it pretends to be, that the cold lives on the skin of the world and the warmth keeps its house deeper in, and that a man who learns where the warmth keeps house need never freeze." He told me once, the winter I was 12, with the wind off the range rattling the one window of our cabin, that the men who died in the Cornish workings died for want of patience and not for want of strength, that they fought the rock instead of asking it, and that the rock would tell you everything if you only stopped shouting at it long enough to hear. I had heard him say it 100 times without hearing it. A child hears the sound of a parent's certainty and not its sense, and it is only later, alone and cold and out of other choices, that the sense comes back and stands up in you like a second person. On the 3rd of October, I began, without knowing, to hear it. If you have ever been handed your whole life in a bundle and told it was charity, stay with me a while, because I mean to show you what I did with it. I started walking up the creek that fed into the green from the north, the one the trappers called Antler, for the shed horns you found along it. And I followed the water, because water always comes from somewhere, and somewhere is always higher than where you are standing with $2 and a cup. I want to be honest about how little I knew that first day, because the people who later called me what they called me believed I had marched up that creek with a plan folded in my apron, and I had no plan. I had a direction, which is a different thing, and I had my father's voice, which is a third thing again, and the most valuable of the three. The creek narrowed as it climbed, the willows giving way to spruce, and then to a steeper shouldered country of broken limestone, gray and seamed and shot through with the rusty stain that my father had taught me meant iron in the water and warmth somewhere near. I slept 2 nights under a deadfall with the tools against my chest, and I ate the last of the bread Carl's wife had pressed on me at the gate. And on the 3rd morning I came around a bend where the creek ran open, even though frost lay white on every leaf around it, and the water there was steaming faintly into the cold air the way a horse steams after a hard run. I knelt and put my hand in it. It was warm, not hot, not the boiling springs they spoke of farther south in the basin, but warm as bath water gone a little tired, and it came up out of a cleft in the limestone where the rock had been dissolved away over a span of time I could not imagine into a low, dark mouth, wide enough to crawl into. I did not crawl in that first hour. I sat on a flat stone and I listened to the mountain the way my father had taught me to listen, with my whole back against the rock, and I felt the faint steady breath of it, the air moving slow out of the dark and then slow back in, which meant the cave went deep, and the deep of it was warmer than the world outside. He had told me that breathing caves are living caves, that a cave with a steady draw has a second mouth somewhere far off, and a fire of its own kind burning in its belly, the slow chemical fire of water and iron and stone. I lit a splinter of pitch pine and held it at the opening and watched the flame lean gently inward, drawn by that breath, and I knew before I had seen a single chamber that I had found the place where the warmth kept its house. I was 19 years old and I had nothing, and I had just become, though no one in Pinnedale would believe it for a year, the richest woman on that mountain. The cave went back farther than my pitch splinter could show me, opening after the first low crawl into a chamber where I could stand with my arms raised and not touch the roof, and the floor was dry sand laid down by some ancient water, and the air was warm enough that I took off my father's coat. There was a seep at the back where the warm water rose into a basin no bigger than a washpan, and trickled out toward the mouth, and there was a natural shelf of stone along one wall as level as a thing a carpenter would make. I understood, sitting in that warm dark with the one splinter burning, that a person could live here, not survive, live, and I understood the second thing too, the harder thing, which was that the moment anyone in the valley learned I had gone to live in a hole in the mountain like an animal, the verdict would be swift and it would be unanimous, and I would become a story they told to frighten children into gratitude for their own four walls. I was right about that. I came down to Pinnedale once before the snow in the last week of October to trade a day's labor at the mercantile for nails and a length of stovepipe and a sack of meal, and I felt the eyes of the town find me before I had reached the hitching rail, the way a cold draft finds the one gap in a wall. Harlan Pruitt, who owned the store and owned by extension most of the small opinions in that valley, was a wide, soft man who kept a toothpick worked in the corner of his mouth and spoke always a little louder than the room required, as men do who have never once been made to doubt themselves. He looked at the iron stain on my hands and the limestone dust on my hem and said it, loud enough for the men by the stove to hear. He said, "There goes the cave rat, gone to keep house with the bats." The men laughed the easy laugh of men who are warm and fed and have never once in their lives been handed their belongings in a bundle. One of them, a teamster named Coombs, allowed that I would not last till spring and that they would find me come thaw curled up stiff in my hole with the other. Vermin and the stove laughed again, and Harlan let the toothpick travel slow across his lip and did not stop them. Cave rat. That was the name, and it stuck to me, like the pine pitch I worked with. And I want you to remember it because you will hear it twice more before this is done, and the third time it will be spoken in a place and a way that Harlan Pruitt never once imagined when he said it the first time over a warm stove to please his friends. I did not answer him. My father had taught me that too, though not in words. He had taught it by the way he worked, which was to let the rock answer for him, slowly and in its own time, and never to argue with a man whose mind was a closed seam. I took my nails and my stovepipe and my meal, and I walked the 9 miles back up Antler Creek, and behind me the laughter died down into the ordinary noise of a town that had already forgotten me, filed me away under the word Harlan had given them, and gone back to being warm. I did not need them to be wrong about me. I needed the mountain to be right about itself. And I had already felt its slow, warm breath against my back, and I trusted that breath more than I had ever trusted the opinion of any porch full of men in my life. The work of that first winter was the work of turning a warm hole into a warm home, and I did it with my father's tools and my father's principles and nothing else. The cave breathed which meant it would never grow foul the way a sealed dugout does. But a breathing cave also loses its warmth to a careless mouth. So the first thing I built was not a stove or a bed, but a baffle, a double wall of stacked flat limestone, packed with creek clay across the entry. Passage with the openings offset so that the cold could not drive straight in, but had to turn, and turning, slow and slowing, surrender its edge to the warm air already there. I quarried the flat stone from a fractured ledge 100 paces down the creek, carrying it up 2 and 3 slabs at a time across my back until my shoulders went raw, and then went hard, and I puddled the clay with creek water in a hollow of the rock, and worked it into the joints with my bare hands until they cracked at the knuckles, the way my father's always had, and I thought, working it, that I was at last growing the hands he had tried to leave me. My father had built such walls in the Cornish adits to keep the working faces from killing the men with bad air and cold, and he had drawn the principle for me once in the dirt with a stick. 2 lines that did not meet, and said, "The cold is lazy. It will not go around a corner if you make the corner sharp enough." I made the corner sharp. I made 2 of them, an outer turn and an inner, with a dead space between where the cold could pool and give up the last of its bite. And I learned by trial across that first month exactly how wide to leave each gap, narrow enough to break the wind and wide enough to keep the cave's slow breath moving, because too tight a wall would have smothered the very draw that kept the air sweet. I held a candle to each gap in turn on the coldest nights and watched the flame, and where it leaned hard I packed more clay, and where it stood straight and easy I left it be. And in that way, the rock and the flame between them taught me the wall my father could only have, drawn me in dirt. The chamber behind held its warmth like a held breath. I had brought a single hen up the creek in a basket that October, a speckled gray hen I had traded my $2 for, and I called her Mabel for no reason, except that she looked like a Mabel, and she became the first other living heartbeat in that mountain with me. She rode my shoulder while I worked. She roosted on the warm stone shelf at night. She laid through the whole of that winter, which no hen has any business doing in the cold months, because the chamber stayed warm as a spring morning while the world outside went to 40 below, and her eggs were the small daily proof that my father had been right about where the warmth keeps house. I tell you about Mabel now because she matters later, and because a winter alone in a mountain is a different thing with a warm speckled hen muttering on a shelf than it is in silence. And I have never since been able to hear a hen settle for the night without my throat going tight. By the deep of that first winter, I had a stone hearth set under a natural flue in the rock that drew the smoke up and out through some chimney of the Plock Mountain's own making, a bed of spruce boughs and traded wool on the level shelf, a row of clay-sealed jars along the wall, holding meal and dried meat and the bitter greens I had put up in the fall, and a door of split spruce hung on leather hinges across the inner baffle. I had no glass and no nails to spare for hinges, so I cut the leather from the tops of my own worn boots, and soaked it and stretched it, and let it dry hard into straps that held that door for 3 winters before I could trade for proper iron. The warm seep gave me water that never froze. The breathing cave gave me air that never failed. I learned the small economy of that place, the way a married woman learns a husband, where the warm air pooled and where it thinned, which corner held the night's heat best, and which to leave the jars in so the meal would not sweat. And I moved my few possessions about that chamber over the weeks until each thing sat where the mountain wanted it. And then I left them so. And on the nights when the wind came down off the Wind River Range and screamed across the mouth of Antler Creek like something with a grievance, I lay on my warm shelf with Mabel muttering above me, and I listened to that wind try every crack and corner of my baffle and find no way in. And I thought of the men by Harlan Pruitt's stove, and I felt no triumph, only a kind of quiet that I had not felt since before my father died. I was not warm because I was lucky. I was warm because a dead man had taught me where to look and because I had listened. The second autumn, a surveyor came up Antler Creek, a young man named Tobias Wells working for the Territorial Land Office, mapping the drainages for a road that the territory wanted and would not get for another 20 years. He came around the bend where the creek runs open in the frost, and he saw the steam. And then he saw my baffle wall and the spruce door and the thin blue thread of my hearth smoke coming out of the limestone. And he stood there a long while with his chains and his transit and his leather notebook. And then he took off his hat. I had not been shown that small courtesy by a man since my father died. He was perhaps 25, with a chapped, sunburnt look of a spent his spars walking lines through country that did not want him, and he had about him the rare quality of a person who would rather understand a thing than judge it. He asked if he might see how the warmth was held, and I, who had not had a soul to explain it to in a year, found myself talking, and he found himself writing, and that notebook is the reason any of this outlived me, though neither of us knew it then. I showed him the lean of the candle flame and the baffle gaps and the rusty water and the warm seep, and I told him in my father's plain words that the cold lives on the skin of the world and the warmth keeps its house deeper in, and he wrote that down too. Slowly, the way a man writes a thing he means to keep, he wrote down the offset baffle and the breathing draw and the warm seep and the angle of the flue, and he wrote in a hand I would not see for 40 years that the woman on Antler Creek had built warmer lodging from raw stone than most men in the valley kept, with cordwood and iron. He did not write cave rat. He wrote a name I did not know I was being given. He wrote the warm house. He told me, before he left, that he had heard them speak of me down in Pinnedale, that Harlan Pruitt had laughed at his store stove and called me the cave rat to pat his face and told him not to waste his survey chain on a madwoman's burrow, and that he had come up the creek, half expecting to find exactly the squalor the town had promised him, and had found instead the warmest lodging in the drainage and a hen laying in January. He said it plainly, not to flatter me, and then he shouldered his transit and went back down the creek to a valley that had already decided what I was. I want to stop here a moment and tell you plainly, because I have come this far with you and you have stayed. What I am describing was never magic and never luck. And if you take one thing from an old woman's account, let it be that the warmth was always there, in that mountain kept deep, waiting only for someone willing to walk upstream past where the sensible people stopped. I came down to the valley one last time that December, 2 weeks before the cold, to trade eggs for a length of leather and a tin of matches, and Harlan Pruitt looked up from his counter and told the men loitering there that the cave rat had come down out of her hole to see how proper people lived, and they laughed. And I took my leather and my matches and climbed back up Antler Creek in the early dark, and that was the last time anyone in Pinnedale laughed at me, though none of us knew it yet. Now let me tell you about the winter that proved it, because the next year the cold came down on that valley like nothing the oldest settler had a memory of, and it came on a date I will carry to my grave, and it asked the whole of Pinnedale the one question a warm stove cannot answer. It began the 9th of January, 1874, with a sky the wrong color, a flat, hard yellow-gray that my father would have read in a glance, and by nightfall the temperature had fallen so far, so fast, that the spit froze before it left your lips. I had seen that color come up over the range 2 days before, low and brassy along the western edge, and I had read it the way he taught me, and brought Mabel deeper into the chamber, and packed a fresh course of clay into the windward gap of my baffle, so that when the cold came, I was not surprised by it, only sobered. The first night it reached 38 below at the valley floor and kept falling. The second day, the wind rose behind the cold and did not so much blow as lean, a steady killing pressure out of the northwest that drove the fallen snow sideways in a white blindness through which a man could not see his own outstretched hand. The storm that came behind the cold was not snow so much as a moving wall of ice and wind that buried the lower road in a single night and did not lift for 9 days. 9 days. I have heard educated men since call it the worst cold event in the recorded history of that part of the territory, and I do not doubt them. But I did not need a record to know it. I needed only to stand at my own warm mouth on the second morning and feel the air outside take the breath from me like a hand at my throat, and to look down the white throat of the valley and see no smoke rising from any chimney I knew, because the families down there were burning their fences, and then their furniture, and then, God help them, the green wood that would not catch, and the smoke that should have risen was being torn flat by a wind that did not stop. Down in the valley, the arithmetic of that storm was cruel, and I will not soften it, though I will not dwell in it either, because those were my neighbors, and some of them had laughed at me, and all of them suffered. The Henson place lost their stock entire, 40 head standing, frozen where they had crowded against the north fence. Old Pruitt's own wood pile, the biggest in the valley, the pile he had been so proud of, ran out on the 5th day, and he and his wife moved into the mercantile cellar and burned the store's own shelving to stay alive. 3 families on the lower creek lost the roofs off their cabins to the weight of driven ice and crowded in with neighbors until neighbors' fuel ran short too. Before it broke, that cold took 11 souls in our valley. 11, most of them the very old and the very young, taken not by the storm's violence but by the simple subtraction of warmth from a body, hour by hour, until there was none left to take. I counted them later by their fresh graves in the spring ground. 11. I want to set my own arithmetic beside theirs the way the surveyor later set it in his report, because the gap between the two numbers is the whole of what my father knew. While the valley burned its fences and lost its 11, the chamber behind my offset baffle held at a temperature I measured each morning with my father's spirit thermometer and wrote in a jar lid scratched with a nail, and the coldest reading I took in those 9 days, with 41 below howling at the mouth, was 54 degrees above zero on my warm shelf, 54 above while the world held at 40 below. I burned not one stick more than I burned on an ordinary night, because the mountain did the burning for me, slow and deep, the way it had been burning since before my father crossed an ocean. Mabel laid an egg on the 3rd day of the storm. I ate it warm, and I would have ridden out those 9 days alone in that warmth and called it only my survival, except that on the 6th night I heard, under the wind, ascended that did belong to the wind, and it was a dog. It was the Pruitt girl's dog, a young chocolate-brown bird dog named Captain, and he had come up Antler Creek in the storm, 'cause dogs know where the warmth keeps house, even when men have forgotten, and behind him, half dead and roped together and following the only thing that seemed to know where it was going, came Harlan Pruitt and his wife, and the 2 Henson children whose parents had pushed them out the door toward the only smoke still rising in the country, the thin blue thread coming out of the limestone 9 miles up a creek where the cave rat lived. I heard Captain first, scratching at my spruce door, and I opened the inner baffle, and the cold came around my sharp corners and lost its edge as it always did, and into my warm chamber on their hands and knees came the man who had named me, and the children he could not save with all his cordwood, and his wife with her hands frozen to claws. They did not see who I was at first. They saw only the warmth, and they crawled toward it the way any living thing crawls toward warmth, without pride, without memory, the way I had crawled up a creek with $2 and a cup 3 years before. I got them onto the warm sand floor, and I worked over them the way my father had worked over half-frozen miners, slow Not too near the hearth too fast. Warm water from the seep on the frozen hands and not hot, and Mabel scolded from her shelf, and Captain pressed his brown body against the smallest Henson child, and would not be moved, and I melted snow, and I fed them broth a spoon at a time through the night, and the chamber that my father's principal had made held all 6 of us in warmth as easily as it had held me alone. I knew from the way my father had told it that the danger in a frozen hand is not the freezing, but the thawing done too fast and too hot, that the warmth must come back the way it left, by patience, or the flesh is lost, and so I kept the Pruitt woman's claws in seep water, no warmer than new milk, and changed it through the dark hours and made her wait, though she wept from the pain of the blood returning, and Harlan begged me to bring her nearer the fire. I would not. I had a dead man's instruction standing up in me, and I trusted it over a frightened husband, and by the gray middle of the night, her fingers had gone from white to a deep, angry red, which is the color of a hand that will heal, and not the gray that does not. Toward morning, the smallest child's color came back, and she slept, truly slept, and Harlan Pruitt sat against my warm stone wall, with his ruined hands wrapped in my wool, and he looked around the chamber, at the jars and the hearth and the warm seep and the offset baffle holding the killing cold at bay, 9 miles from the town that had buried 11 of its own, and he looked at me, and I watched him understand the whole of it at once. He was quiet a long time. Then he said the only thing there was to say, and he said it low, not to please anyone, because there was no one left to please. He said, "You were never the fool." That was all. 4 words, and the wind took the rest. I did not answer him, and I did not need to. My father had taught me that the rock answers for you if you let it, and the rock was answering then in 54 degrees of warmth, while 40 below screamed at the door, and there was nothing I could add to that answer that would not make it smaller. I put another spoon of broth to the child's lips. Captain sighed and stretched against her, and Harlan Pruitt, who had named me cave rat over a warm stove to make his friends laugh, sat in my warm dark with his frozen hands and wept without sound for the 11 he had not been able to save. And I let him because grief is not mine to take from a man, and because I had no triumph in me, only the old quiet and the slow breath of the mountain moving warm around all of us. The cold broke on the 18th of January. They stayed with me 4 more days until the lower road could be broken open. And in those 4 days, the man who had named me learned my baffle, the way I had once learned my father's voice, asking, listening, his ruined hands tracing the offset corners. When they went down at last, they carried the children warm and whole, and they carried something else that could not be wrapped in wool, which was the knowledge of where the warmth keeps house, and what it costs to learn it and what it costs not to. Tobias Wells, the surveyor, came back that spring with his notebook and found me with 6 neighbors' worth of fresh story to add to his pages, and he wrote it all down. The storm and the 54 degrees and the 11 graves and the 6 saved, and he carried that notebook to the land office in Cheyenne, and it sat in a drawer there the way warmth sits deep in a mountain, waiting. The valley did not make me a heroine. That is not how people are, and I never wanted it. What the valley did was slower and truer than that. The next autumn, 3 families came up Antler Creek to ask me how it was done, hats in hand on the same flat stone, where I had first sat and listened to the mountain breathe. And I showed them, freely, the way Tobias had shown courtesy to me, and the way my father had shown me a principle drawn in dirt with a stick. I walked them along the limestone country and taught them to look for the rusty stain in the water and the open creek in the frost and the slow steam rising where no steam should rise, and I taught them to lay a hand on the rock and go still, and to hold a candle at the mouth and read the lean of the flame. 2 of those families understood and went and found their own breathing seams in the limestone country and built their own warm houses. and live in them to this day. The third family copied only the shape of the thing, the wall and the door, and built it against a cold, dead cliff with no warm breath in it, and were cold, and came back angry, and accused me of keeping the true secret to myself, and I had to teach them the hard half of the lesson, which is that you cannot copy the warmth, you can only go to where it already lives. My father had known that too. He had watched men in Cornwall timber a gallery exactly as the next gallery was timbered, and lose it anyway, because the rock was different rock, and he had told me the form is the easy half, and the reading is the whole. The inheritance was never the wall. The inheritance was knowing which mountain breathes. Harlan Pruitt became, in the strange way of corrected men, my truest friend in that valley for the 20 years left to him. He stole the story against himself at every chance. The cave rat and the warm stove and the 4 words he said on the 6th night, and he told it not to punish himself, but because he had learned the thing late that I want you to learn early, that the people a town agrees to laugh at are very often the people who have walked upstream past where the laughter stops and have found there the thing the town most needs and does not know it needs. He died warm, in a stone house his sons built on my father's principle, in the winter of '94, and his last gift to me was the spirit thermometer returned, the one I had measured the 54 degrees with, which had been his own father's before mine, and which I had never known he recognized. Tobias Wells's notebook came out of its drawer 40 years later, when the territory had become a state and a younger man at the survey office found it and saw what it held and wrote about the warm house on Antler Creek for a journal of the Historical Society, and that is how the method outlived me, and how it reached past my own valley into the cold country to the north, where men still build the offset, baffle and call it, some of them, the Cornish wall without knowing there was a Cornish man behind it. My father, dead these many years, who could read the inside of a mountain like a pulse, and who left me knowledge instead of money, and thereby left me the only inheritance that mattered. Tobias himself wrote me once, an old man by then as I was an old woman, to say he had spent a life mapping country, and had never again found a thing he was so glad to have set down, and that he thought of the steam off Antler Creek whenever the cold came hard. The young men who build the warm wall now do not know my name. They do not need to. They know the principle, and the principle is the part that lasts. I am old now, older than my father lived to be, and I still live up Antler Creek in the warm house, though the baffle has been rebuilt 3 times and the spruce door 5, and there is a chocolate-brown dog at my feet as I tell you this, a granddaughter many times over of the captain who came scratching at my door in the storm, and she knows the warm sand and the slow breath of the mountain, the way her people have always known it. In the long evenings I sit at the mouth where the creek runs open in the frost and steams into the cold, and I watch the thin blue thread of my hearth smoke rise the way it rose. The night 6 frozen people followed a dog to my door, and I think about how little I had that October morning. $2 and a tin cup and a bundle they told me was charity. They thought they had given me nothing. Far up a frozen creek, where the sensible people stopped and the willing one kept walking, the warm breath of the mountain still moves slow out of the dark and slow back in, and the smoke still rises, and the warmth still keeps its house exactly where my father said it would, deeper in than the cold can reach, for anyone with the heart to walk that far and the quiet to listen.